this has truly been a manic Monday on Wall Street. There's the bankruptcy.
At Lehman's European headquarters, they're carrying out their careers in boxes. 5,000
Who knows where this is going to end up? I mean, this is volatility we haven't seen, of course, since way before you and I were born.
You know, this shakes your core. This shakes your trust in American institutions.
Hello, I'm Barbara Serra, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the stories we're covering this week. The financial press didn't quite see the crash coming 10 years ago. Are they better equipped to alert us to imminent economic disasters now? Another powerful media man is taken down by the Me Too movement. On the trail of fake online accounts and bots pushing an agenda of regime change in Iran. And an economic debate for the ages.
I want to steer markets. I want them set free.
What can a government do when there is an economic crisis? Exactly a decade ago, the world was hit by the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression in the U.S. Trillions of dollars were sucked out of the global economy, tens of millions of people lost their jobs, and austerity economics was imposed across many countries. Here at The Listening Post, we reported back then on the failings of the financial coverage, failings that meant the crash came as a huge surprise to many around the world. The financial press cheered on a bubble that eventually burst, showed a lack of skepticism about Wall Street claims, and failed to expose what was, in effect, mass fraud on their own beat, namely the mis-selling of mortgages to millions of Americans. In the aftermath, some outlets apologized for the shortcomings in their reporting. But 10 years on, how much has actually changed? The Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi now on the lessons of 2008 and the new challenges facing reporters on the business and economy beats today.
Right now, breaking news here, stocks all around the world are tanking because of the crisis on Wall Street.
2008 was a year of reckoning for governments, regulators, financial institutions, and the journalists who reported on them.
Today, the Z Index over in Frankfurt is down by 9%. The Paris market down by 9%. Austria, which was briefly suspended.
It was like a war zone. Think about it, the institutions that had been around since the Great Depression, Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, Merrill Lynch, for all intents and purposes, disappeared during this crisis.
There's the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers, the sale of Merrill Lynch to Bank of America, and word of trouble with the world's largest insurance company, American International Group.
Most of what drove the financial crisis was not concealed by some dastardly James Bond-style plot. Most of it was just widely ignored by the public and politicians and most journalists.
You know, this shakes your core. This shakes your trust in American institutions.
Most of the coverage leading up to the crash ignored the really central problem, which was that fraud and predatory tactics were rife, and they were really what drove the crash.
This is America. How many of you people want to pay for your neighbor's mortgage that has an extra bathroom and can't pay their bills? Raise their hand. How about we all?
No matter how critical we are of financial journalism, it molded itself around a system that was unsustainable. That was its failure. But let us never forget that it was malfeasance, miscalculation, and misregulation that caused the problem.
In the years leading up to the financial crash, global stock markets hit new highs. Real estate was booming. Investment banks used ever more complicated financial instruments, primarily collateralized debt obligations, CDOs, and credit default swaps, CDSs, that not only enabled riskier and riskier mortgages to be given, but allowed banks to make more and more money off them. When people started to default en masse, the banks found themselves in too deep. In a world in which banks relied on borrowing from each other for survival, it set off a domino effect.
Before 2007 and 8, very few mainstream financial outlets were looking at the world of complex credit and derivatives and subprime mortgages and debt. I wrote about it a fair amount myself because I became absolutely fascinated by the question of what on earth are the geeks doing in these dark corners that we don't understand. Most journalists thought that those kind of areas of finance were boring and technical and dull, and you couldn't get it on the front page of a newspaper, you couldn't get it on the top of the running of a television show. So that whole world got totally ignored.
Financial journalists in particular began to understand that all the nuance and the details of these incredibly complex instruments mattered. But at the same time, if you were out there saying, oh my God, watch out for CDSs, watch out for CDOs, you were treated like somebody wearing a tinfoil hat. You were not considered somebody who understood finance.
Probing the culture of the financial press is central to any critical examination of its performance. In the years after the crash, critics on the outside and voices from inside the newsrooms pointed out some of the most problematic aspects of how the financial media operates.
Hey, Warren, my man, Creighton,
They cited groupthink, a reliance on access to industry insiders, and crucially, a sense that financial reporters have to be as enthused about the bottom lines of the companies they report on as the business's executives themselves.
It's like covering a sports team. You have a tendency to start cheering because it's more exciting to cover something where there's lots of money rolling around and profits are high. And by defining it that way, you're really sort of limiting your scope of vision. You know, how are consumers treated? What are the checks and balances within the company? Those kind of things often are forgotten. If a company is doing well, if a market is booming, it's very easy to just sort of let the good times roll.
One of the really big things that happened around the start of the 21st century was that television in the financial world and markets became much more important. It's much easier to convey a sense of manic excitement through a television studio interview than it is in the pages of a newspaper or a wire service.
It's fair to say that people like me who questioned the system and the sustainability of the boom, we weren't shouted down, but you were looked on as a kind of unnecessary troublemaker. There was a cultural pressure to say, well, if the great and good say it goes on forever, it goes on forever. Especially because in the background, you've got these relentless channels of kind of one-dimensional, weird propaganda for the bottom line. You know, the American business channels. It's easy to get sucked into their world.
We're coming out of a session. S&P 500 closing at its highest level all year to date.
There's a question to be asked about audiences and how their interests shape journalistic output. The financial press is consumed in large part by a niche group: traders, investors, bankers, and CEOs. What's good news for them, say for instance company mergers or credit bubbles, are often reported positively by the financial press. What often goes underreported are wider impacts and concerns. This can be contagious because so many mainstream outlets take their cues on business and financial reporting from the specialist press. And then there's the question of sources. Business journalists rely on their relationships with the executives they report on for stories. Access is priceless.
When you go to your annual shareholder meetings, do you get a standing ovation for what you've done?
There is a careful balance of being able to get the CEO to come back on your channel and being able to get the CEO to give you some news. I don't think that, in my experience of either Bloomberg or CNBC, we ever pulled punches. We worked really hard to actually give difficult interviews. You need to ask the question in a way that isn't rude, because the viewers will immediately think you're being awful to this guest that you've invited on your show.
In the aftermath of the financial crisis, there's been a lot of introspection by the media. Journalists had to face the failings of their work before 2008 and reassess their approach to the finance and economy beats. There's still work to be done.
The media is still very obsessed with the issues that created the last crisis. The one thing we can count on is that the next crisis won't come from exactly the same area. It will be something else, like what's happening with the pension system today, what's happening with, say, exchange-traded funds, what's happening with other areas of financial technology, fintech. Plus, there are other areas of our life where you have, once again, geeks in control of a technology that no one else understands.
I think that the financial media has become a bit more skeptical post-2008, but I wouldn't say that there's been a massive culture change. We're not thinking about the health of society, health of a nation, how well customers are being treated. That's really kind of a secondary thing. So that does worry me, but that says there has been some really good reporting. The Los Angeles Times did great reporting breaking the Wells Fargo fake account scandal. But in general, there are a lot of financial stories out there that aren't getting the kind of digging, investigative reporting that they merit.
I think there is a strategic mismatch between much of journalism and the kind of world that we live in. Business journalism cannot be like sports journalism. It has to ask the question, should this match even be being played to the rules it's being played? Sports journalism cannot ask that of a football match. We must ask that of a banking system. Are the rules right? Are the players all crooks? Is the game futile? Is it destroying the society we live in?
We're discussing other media stories that are on our radar this week with one of our producers, Flo Phillips. Flo, let's start with Les Moonves, longtime boss of one of the biggest US TV networks, that's CBS, and he stepped down over a series of allegations of sexual misconduct. Not the first resignation we've seen since the start of the Me Too movement. Why is this one such a big deal?
For lots of reasons, Barbara. Les Moonves, as chairman, president and CEO, really is CBS, or rather, he was. He successfully led that network for more than 2 decades, and such a long time in this industry is pretty rare. But the Me Too movement has really changed everything. Nobody is off limits anymore. In a span of just 10 months, CBS has lost Charlie Rose, who hosted the morning news show, Jeff Fager, the head of its signature investigative program 60 Minutes, and Moonves. After the allegations about Moonves first surfaced back in July, CBS launched an investigation, but he hung on, even after he'd admitted and apologised for some of his behaviour. Then last weekend, Ronan Farrow, the journalist credited with the Harvey Weinstein expose almost a year ago now, detailed a further 6 allegations from additional women, and Moonves was gone in a matter of hours.
Well, Moonves may be gone, but there's still some questions about his seemingly quite large severance package. How big are we talking about exactly?
So that's really going to depend on the outcome of this CBS investigation. If Moonves is found to be guilty, he'll get nothing. Otherwise, the details of his contract mean he could walk away with as much as $120 million. It was originally $140 million, but Moonves and CBS are collectively donating $20 million to organisations that support equality for women in the workplace and the Me Too movement. Now, needless to say, Moonves continues to deny the allegations in Farrow's reports.
We'll definitely follow developments on that story. Let's move on now to something else that happened earlier this week. YouTube removed several accounts run by the Syrian government. What reasons have they given for doing it, and why now?
So we're talking here about some of the major channels, accounts associated with President Assad's office, the Ministry of Defense, as well as the Syrian Arab news agency, SANA. This all comes at a time when Syrian forces, along with their Russian ally, have launched fresh strikes on Idlib, the last major city held by anti-regime forces. YouTube appears to have been pushed into taking this step after a report came out detailing how these accounts were generating income through ads that were being played before their content. And that's a clear violation of the 2011 order issued by President Obama, banning American companies from doing any business with Syria.
This potentially sets a precedent, though, and the same thing could happen, I guess, to the accounts of other countries and other governments that the US doesn't get on with. I'm thinking of Iran as an obvious example.
Potentially. In a statement, a YouTube spokesperson said that YouTube complies with all applicable sanctions and trade compliance laws. If we find that an account violates our terms of service or community guidelines, we disable it. Now, given how active YouTube and other social media sites have been lately when it comes to blocking various content, there could indeed be more to come.
Flo, thank you. The debate over Iran has always been polarizing. No surprise for a country that's been on the wrong end of United States foreign policy for nearly 4 decades. And with the withdrawal of the US from the Iran nuclear deal this year, those calling for the hardest line against the Islamic Republic, starting with more sanctions, have received a boost. On the other side of the debate, those pushing back against what many say is an agenda for regime change are reporting an online backlash the likes of which they've not seen before. However, the Twitter accounts doing the trolling may not be the organic opposition voices that they're made out to be. For all the accusations of disinformation and fake news from both sides, it's rare that we can point to facts, a location, and actual personnel explaining the modus operandi of an organized troll factory. The Listening Post's Will Young investigated this story, and the trail has led not to Tehran, Washington, D.C., or Riyadh, but to Tirana in Albania.
Iran has now joined Russia as a country accused of using the internet to sow chaos for its adversaries. While evidence of the effectiveness of Iran's campaign is far from conclusive, last month Twitter announced it had suspended some 800 accounts said to be involved in coordinated manipulation it said was linked to the country. But there's another side to this story. Thousands of accounts, many of them likely automated, that are boosting trends presenting the Islamic Republic as the implacable enemy of the West and of the rights of its own people.
The turning point was really Trump's election. Once it became very clear from the outset that there would be really heightened hostility with Iran, there was a profusion of new accounts, anonymous accounts who were very single-mindedly and purposefully going after people who talked about Iran with nuance. The majority of it is abusive, libelous, ad hominem, and intended to silence.
Mindful of the difficulty for Western journalists to be able to have access to Iran, the majority of journalists are looking to Twitter as a proxy of where the debate is going, where the sentiments are, where the trends are going. Twitter attacks and these social media campaigns have at least initially been successful in giving the impression that this small minority who's supporting the Trump administration's policy actually constitute a majority or a growing majority.
The simplest kind of social media engineering is not much more than a numbers game. Twitter bots, created by the hundreds or thousands, can be programmed to tweet and retweet automatically in order to boost trends artificially. On a smaller scale, individuals or groups can copy, paste and tweet using several accounts to multiply the impact of their ideas. Twitter would not share with us its own methodology for detecting fake accounts, but openly available metadata can tell us a lot about where to look.
When there's loads of bots, you might see hundreds and hundreds, in some cases thousands of accounts created on a specific day. The majority of the accounts tweeting on the Free Iran hashtag, the Iran regime change hashtag, from the period of late December to May, were created within about a 4-month window. What that would suggest is that a lot of the activity on those hashtags, Free Iran and Iran regime change, are bots.
But there's only so much you can discover online. So we followed rumours of an anti-Iranian government fake account factory to Albania. Between 2013 and 2016, the United Nations, at the behest of the United States, relocated some 2,900 members of an exiled Iranian opposition group calling itself the People's Mujahideen of Iran, or MEK as it's otherwise known, to this camp behind me, less than 1 hour's drive from the capital, Tirana. Former members of the group confirm that part of this heavily guarded facility is a troll farm dedicated to social media manipulation on an industrial scale.
We would receive daily orders highlighting the main ongoing issues in Iran. For example, high prices, unemployment, poverty. We had to bring them to the attention of the world by tweeting them and blaming them on the Islamic regime in one way or the other. This was our duty on a daily basis in cyberspace.
The daily order might tell us which newspapers had published a favorable news piece, or if a politician such as John McCain or John Bolton had spoken against the regime in an interview. We would then like the tweet and leave comments as if they genuinely came from people in Iran. Any piece of news that could be used to their benefit and against the Iranian regime would be gold, regardless of where it came from, whether it be Israel, the US, Trump, anyone.
Our stance towards those who even slightly sided with the regime or were critical of our organization, such as Trita Parsi, was that they were hirelings and puppets of the regime. We'd label them as exported soldiers of the mullah's regime, who are enjoying themselves in America.
Because of my platform, I have received a significant amount of Twitter attacks of this kind, but I am nowhere near being alone. This is actually a very pervasive phenomenon. The big victim of this is that we don't have a rational conversation about policy towards Iran, or even what the situation is like inside of Iran right now.
Case in point, at the end of 2017 and the beginning of this year, a series of protests flared up in a number of Iranian cities. Hashtags promoting regime change spiked, shaping the narrative for many in the mainstream media. We now know that much of that online activity was externally engineered.
A lot of the activity around the protest in Iran has been exploited by whoever's setting up these bot networks, a certain community, as it were, that are promoting the MEK and using unrest in Iran as a platform. I have found what I believe to be bot accounts supportive of the Iranian government, and they do appear to be bots, but at the moment they seem far smaller in volume.
Our orders would tell us which hashtags to use in our tweets. There were popular hashtags such as national demonstrations or I will overthrow. They told us to use these hashtags to make them more active. It was our job to provide coverage of the protests by seeking out, tweeting and retweeting videos, as well as adding our own comments to them.
Overall, I'd say that several thousand accounts are managed by about 1,000 to 1,500 MEK members. It was all very well organized, and there were clear instructions about what needed to be done. Any other online activities or web surfing were prohibited. They would tell us that the devices provided by the organization were like weapons, and our tweets were bullets to shoot at the enemy. So why waste them?
The cult-like Mujahideen Khalq has almost no support in Iran. Many still remember the domestic terror campaign it ran in the years following the revolution, and how MEK forces fought alongside Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq war. However, the organization has cultivated powerful friends abroad. Britain lifted its designation as a terrorist organization in 2008. The EU did the same in 2009, and the United States in 2012. After the MEK was forced out of Iraq, it was the US who brokered a deal to resettle them in Albania, where their social media campaign against the Islamic Republic continues.
This activity is very much focused on the debate in the West, because I think the intention is in part to prepare public opinion in the West for whatever kind of regime change agenda Washington is pursuing.
If the regime continues its nuclear aspirations, it will have bigger problems than it has ever had before.
These MEK members, they have no way back. They are absolutely desperate and, are probably willing to get behind anything.
It's not like what happens on social media stays there anymore. It filters its way into mainstream media. There is so much propaganda, so much fake news. It would take very little to create a wave of what looks like popular Iranian opinion against the government that's not necessarily real.
The MEK did not agree to our request for an interview, telling us that plots involving agents of Iran posing as journalists made any contact impossible. That leaves only defectors stranded in Albania to tell the story of how keyboard warriors use and abuse social media to promote an agenda for regime change.
And finally, we're closing our show this week with a video that came out in the years just after the 2008 crash. With so much talk of finance and the economy becoming mainstream, an American economist and a TV producer teamed up and created a rap battle to break down a long-running debate on how governments should react to an economic crisis. The two main characters in this video are the 20th century economists John Maynard Keynes and Friedrich von Hayek. Keynes, a flamboyant Brit, argued that government spending was needed to grow the economy out of recession. Hayek, a more measured Austrian, believed the opposite, that government attempts to control the economy were the problem. Neither man lived to see the crisis, and in this video entitled Fear the Boom and Bust, they are reborn, strangely with American accents. However, given where the financial crisis and rap both originated, it's something we can overlook. We'll see you next time right here at The Listening Post.
John Maynard Keynes wrote the book on modern macro, the man you need when the economy's off track. Depression, recession, now your question's in session. Have a seat and I'll school you in one simple lesson. Boom, 1929, the big crash. We didn't bounce back, economy's in the trash. Persistent unemployment, the result of sticky wages. Waiting for recovery, that's outrageous. I had a real plan, any fool can understand. The advice real simple, boost aggregate demand. C-I-G, altogether gets to Y. Keep that total growing, watch the economy fly.
The place you should study isn't the bust, it's the boom that should make you feel leery. That's the thrust of my theory. The capital structure is key. Malinvestments wreck the economy. Whether it's the late 20s or 2005, booming bad investments seems like they'd thrive. You must save to invest, don't use the printing press, or a bust will surely follow, an economy depressed. Your so-called stimulus will make things worse. Just more of the same, more incentives perverse. And that credit crunch ain't a liquidity trap, just a broke banking system. I'm done, that's a wrap.
We've been going back and forth for a century. I want to steer markets,
I want them set free.
There's a boom and bust cycle and good reason to fear it.
Blame low interest rates.
It's the animal spirits